I'm Robert Kostrzewa. I'm Vice Dean at the New School for Social Research. And it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this year's Heuss lecture. Will Milberg had something today that he couldn't reschedule, so he apologizes. He would have been the one who welcomes you to the school. The Heuss Professorship is both part of the legacy of the New School for Social Research as a home to German scholarship in the United States, going back to our founding as the University in Exile, as well as a lifeline to our ongoing collaboration with scholars and institutions of higher learning in Germany. The professorship, which was established in the early 1960s, honors the memory of Theodor Heuss, of course, President of the Federal Republic of Germany from 1949 to 1959. Heuss actually visited the New School. He received an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from the university in 1958. And during that visit, he recommended the endowment of a German chair at the graduate faculty, as we were then known. The Federal Republic actually put substantial resources into the professorship, and also the initial funding was provided by the Volkswagen Foundation, which may not be such a great accommodation. When the first Heuss professors came to the graduate faculty in the mid-1960s, they encountered some colleagues who might have been their own teachers back in Germany. They also found at the New School the older German idea and ideal of the university. In fact, some of the Heuss professors have remarked that the graduate faculty was being more German than their home institutions in Germany. I'm told that in the 1960s, some of our departments still conducted faculty meetings in German. So fast forwarding some 50 years, I wanted to mention just one thing. The 50th anniversary conference celebration of the professorship, which was held here at the university in 2013 and was co-sponsored by our relatively new friend and partner, the German Research Foundation. I don't know if anybody from the FG is here. During that event, which assessed the state of the social sciences and social research in the United States and Germany, we also made an important pledge of continued scholarly collaboration between German universities and research institutes and the New School. So the Heuss Professorship is at the very center of that ongoing work, and the DFG pledged to support research by any returning Heuss professor, or any earlier Heuss professor for that matter, and New School faculty and students. I will now ask Alice Crary, Professor of Philosophy and Chair of Philosophy Department, to introduce this year's Heuss Professor, Rahel Jaeggi.
So let me echo Robert's welcome. It is my honor and also my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, the NSSR's current honorary Heuss professor, the philosopher Rahel Jaeggi. For those of you who haven't had the chance to get to know her, I open with a few words about who she is and about why an ongoing relationship with her is enormously important for the NSSR, as well as for our larger intellectual community at the university and beyond it. Rahel holds the Chair of Practical Philosophy, which encompasses philosophy, law, and social philosophy, at the Institute for Philosophy at Humboldt University in Berlin. She is Frankfurt trained, and she's a public intellectual in the spirit of the Frankfurt School. She's also easily one of the most prominent, significant, and exciting thinkers of her generation to carry on its best traditions. A unifying theme of her work is pursuit of the sort of emancipatory theory of society that has been a key ambition of the Frankfurt School's members. Rahel's books and other scholarly publications don't by any means provide a full measure of her contributions. Nevertheless, these are many and noteworthy. Let me single out the following three works. There is, to begin with, her debut 1997 monograph on Hannah Arendt, that is Welt und Person zum Anthropologon. I knew I would do that in person. Vor einem Publikum. Zum anthropologischen Hintergrund der Gesellschaftskritik Hannah Arendts. In 2005, Rahel published a major book on alienation and Fremdung, which was brought out in English by Columbia University Press under the title Alienation in 2014, and which elegantly mobilizes Hegelian ideas to resuscitate a concept of alienation as a decisive and necessary tool for critique. Whereas in Alienation, she is primarily concerned with ethical resources for social and political thought, in her most recent book, she demonstrates her acute sense of the political stakes of her ethical posture. This most recent book is her landmark 2013 monograph, Kritik von Lebensformen, which was published by Suhrkamp and is currently being translated by Harvard University Press under the title Critique of Forms of Life. In it, she launches a direct attack on classic liberal political theorizing that assumes there can be no question of authoritatively assessing social practices, and that, to use her signature slogan, insists that political theory needs to be ethically abstinent. Rahel counters that social practices are such that when we bring them into focus in ethical and political context, we cannot help but indulge in ethics. And guided by this claim, she presents a fresh and provocative account of what transformative and liberating social and political thought is like. Among her many striking current projects is an effort to use material from classic ideology critique to illuminate and productively engage a set of new critical responses within Anglo-American philosophy to racist and classist ideologies in the U.S. Another arresting current project is the defense, in the face of notable challenges, of the very idea of moral progress. That is the topic of today's Heuss lecture, which is entitled The Dialectics of Progress. I hope you'll join me in welcoming our colleague and our dear friend.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, everyone. It's really not only a great honor, it's a great pleasure to be here. And it's not only an honor to be invited to this talk today and to talk to you about progress today, but most of all, it's that the philosophy department, that the New School for Social Research, that everyone who has worked in order to host me and actually our whole family for this year. This is already an exciting year for us. It has been a wonderful year. Actually, when I came here first in September, I was talking to one of the German officials who are in charge of the Heuss professor, and he said, "I don't expect to see you very often because people only show up at my office when there's some problem, some kind of complaint, but Heuss professors are always happy." And I have to say that he was right. I mean, being here for the last couple of months already, I realized I really was always happy, as is my family. And this is not only, I mean, his explanation was, I mean, you just give them a position at a wonderful university and in a wonderful city, so why wouldn't they be happy? And this is absolutely right, both about the city, about the the institution and also about the way that this institution, the New School for Social Research, and this city interacts. It's not only a wonderful and unique institution full of academic inspiration and of fascinating intellectual exchange, which is rare, or is it something that one shouldn't take for granted. It also lives from the kind of interacting with this vibrant city. So both city and the institution, of course, add up to this experience that Theodor Heuss professors had. I have wonderful colleagues here, I have wonderful students, and I have to say that my teaching experience here was maybe the most rewarding teaching experience that I've had in the last couple of years, or at least for a long time. So this was just this were a wonderful month, and I'm looking forward to the next couple of months or weeks to come. Actually, coming to the New School was also something like coming home for me, but also for a lot of my colleagues, at least in the philosophy department, who have had meaningful and very important interactions with the department, the philosophy department, and the sociology and the political science department over the last decades. So for my generation, at least, this kind of interaction and the exchange with the New School was part of my philosophical and political education. So one can already say that the Heuss professorship is somewhat very successful, a living institution that is not only something that is there from the past, but has created a lot of relationships and, as I said, this kind of intellectual and political exchange that has been so important for all of us. Talking of which, the political experience, one might also say that the relation to the university in exile, of the fact that this is an embodiment and a remembrance of the university in exile. For me, this was not only very important because, as Alice has mentioned, I've been working on Hannah Arendt for quite a long time, so the New School has always been a very, very special place for me. With an Arendtian spirit. But it's also the fact that you are still a university in exile somehow and still hosting, not German refugees anymore, but are ready to interact with people whose voice in the academic field is not heard, might not be heard as loud as it should be. One might say that the idea of a university in exile is with respect to the ongoing and the massive refugee problem that we are facing all over the world. And actually it was a bit of a peculiar situation for me that the refugee situation in Germany has just become so important, has become such a major issue in German politics. While I was here having this university in exile related position, but I still think it's an important thing that we might remember that this kind of institutions and the refugee problem, as again Hannah Arendt has analyzed decades before, is something that hasn't been solved. It is an ongoing problem that might be in need of institutions such as University in Exile and the New School, who still has and does a lot in order to make things possible for academics all over the world. So now I'm going to talk about progress. What I'm going to deal with is a question that has repeatedly preoccupied contemporary philosophical discussion, and which seems to me to be indispensable for a critical theory of society, at least a critical theory of society in the left-Hegelian tradition and the critical theory tradition that a lot of people here are related to or have been working in. Namely, the question of moral progress. The question I would like to ask is, how should we conceive of social change and moral progress? How do they come about? How are the two phenomena, moral progress and social change, related to each other? And how can they be evaluated as change for the better? In fact, my thesis is already implicit in the combination of the above-mentioned aspects. First, moral progress, I want to claim, can be understood, assuming it can be understood, only in the context of a more comprehensive dynamic of social change. Secondly, social change is in turn a reaction to crisis. It is a reaction to the pressure of problems that necessitates change. Whether such change then is merely a matter of alteration of circumstances, or in fact constitutes progress in the sense of a change for the better, can be seen only from the form assumed by this dynamic of change itself, although perhaps only through a negative diagnosis of phenomena of regression. My aim in these remarks is to lay the groundwork for a non-teleological, pragmatist, materialistic, and in this sense plural or multidimensional concept of progress. I start with a disclaimer, since the topic of progress is not only inescapable, but also heavily disputed, so it might be important to let you know what I'm actually not going to talk about, not only what I'm going to talk about. Most importantly, I'm not talking about progress as an empirical fact. That is, I'm not claiming or even dealing with the claim that history is actually moving towards progress or moving progressively. I'm rather interested in progress or even progressiveness as a category and evaluative criterion within social philosophy. What does it mean to deal with progress as a concept as against empirical reality, and why would one want to engage in this? The intuition that has led me to reassess or rethink the topic is less related to the idea of progress as a positive goal, as something that informs our utopian hopes and directs our emancipatory efforts. It is rather related to the conviction that progress and its counterpart regression is a fruitful concept in social philosophy. We can't even make sense of our social world and its wrongs and cruelties without the notion of regression. And that the notion of regression, as it is dependent then on the notion of progress, as an important dimension to what we can do as social philosophers and as political agents. Adorno and Horkheimer certainly have not thought of the actual world history as an irresistible and irreversible process toward the better. And yet they still couldn't do otherwise than analyze fascism in terms of regression. But then it makes a difference whether we judged fascism as an instance of moral evil, which is indisputably also true, or whether we analyze it in terms of regression. Third, I'm not asking about global progress, at least this is what I start with, but about local or sectorial instances of progress. That is, I'm disentangling the idea of progress as it has evolved in the 18th century from its connection with the heavyweight concept of a unified world history as we find it most prominently in Hegel's vision of history. As a unified process with the center and with margins which in the worst case are situated entirely outside of history. If progress can occur with respect to this or that local institution or practice, it doesn't have to add up to progress as such or for mankind. To the contrary, progress with respect to one sphere of life might even lead to regress in another. Also, progress once achieved might not be stable. If I start now my paper with an inquiry into moral progress, that is, into the changes in the generally accepted conceptions in terms of which we understand and evaluate morally relevant questions of social life, this is not only because I react to an ongoing discussion within contemporary moral and political philosophy, led, for example, by Elizabeth Anderson, Appia, Michelle Moody Adams, Joshua Cohn, or Philip Kitcher. I also react to the fact that the supposed unity or harmony between technological, scientific, social, and moral progress presupposed in the classical idea of progress as it has been invented in the 18th century and was responsible for much of its optimism seems to be out of question today. That social and moral progress comes as a necessary result of technological progress, that social domination would decrease with the increase of mankind's mastery over nature, Marx in this respect is only mouthing an Enlightenment axiom in this respect, is not a thesis anyone is likely to adopt. The reaction to this is most often to give up the connection at all, and to investigate into moral progress as an isolated phenomenon. If this now is my starting point as well, my paper will tentatively and cautiously widen the perspective again in order to conceive of social change and progress as a multifactorial process that again includes some of these dimensions mentioned above. So I will start my paper by spelling out the question, or the set of questions that are involved in the question about moral progress. What led to the demise of the institution of slavery? How is it that, notwithstanding all the problems of implementation and enforcement, marital rape is today regarded as a crime that is subject to legal prosecution, whereas for centuries it was considered to be the self-evident right of a husband to make his wife compliant even against her will, and if necessary by force? And how can one explain that beating children, which until relatively recently was considered to be an obvious educational measure, is today frowned upon in our societies and is subject to legal sanctions, even though it has not disappeared entirely? In recent years, these and similar changes have received increasing philosophical attention and have been studied under the heading of moral progress. Notwithstanding the reservations that are now common in philosophy and in real life about the notion of general or global social and moral progress, there seems to be a relatively broad consensus about such individual and restricted local or sectorial instances of change. Only very few authors do not regard the developments described as positive. And for all the skepticism, there is a pronounced tendency to evaluate developments that would annul the state of affairs achieved as a result as a kind of relapse. One is tempted to say with Adorno, what at this time should be understood by the term progress, one knows vaguely but precisely. But what are we actually asking about when we raise the question of moral progress? In such discussions, moral progress refers to changes in the generally accepted conceptions in terms of which we understand and evaluate morally relevant questions of social life, and to the corresponding changes in the shape of the social practices and institutions, where a positive evaluation is attached to the changes in question. Such a process is conceived as progress insofar as it is not just a matter of change, alteration as such, but of change for the better. The pitfalls are obvious. Whether something counts as progress, as regression, or as neutral, is a question of how the change in question is evaluated. A particular development may not represent progress for all concerned. The corresponding innovations are generally highly contentious, especially at the beginning of transformation processes. And some change is more than superficially ambivalent. But then, even though it is correct to point out that the concept of progress has an evaluative component, it would be inappropriate to follow Van Wright in separating talk of moral progress into two independent aspects. As he says, I quote, the notion of change and the notion of goodness. A detachment of the descriptive aspect, the norm-free description of change as change, from the evaluative and ethical aspect, namely the evaluation of this change as change for the better, would miss the point. It robs the question of progress of its independence. But such a decomposition not only fails to capture the political historical semantics of the concept of progress, it does not capture its systematic content either. My point here is that to call something progress is to identify a quality that does not coincide with the evaluation of its effect, that is, the result, but instead refers to the form of change, to the process of transformation toward the good or the better as such. To assert that the abolition of slavery represents progress is not the same thing as to say that it is right. And vice versa, to interpret fascism or different forms of fundamentalism as regressive phenomena means something more and different than to say that they are morally wrong. Apparently, the development in question is progressive or regressive as a movement or in its dynamic. When we speak of progress or improvements, we take our orientation from the process of becoming better, of productive or even accumulative transformation, and conversely we assume that there can be regressions behind a state already achieved. The question about progress then is transformed. It is about the form of change that, as I suggest, we should ask. If I initially focus in what follows on how the change that we call moral progress comes about, and subsequently return to the question of how this change should be evaluated, I nevertheless specifically do not want to separate these two moments from each other. Instead, my thesis is that the dynamic of the change conceived as progress in particular has implications for how it can be evaluated. Or even stronger, it is not before we understand how these changes come about that we will be able to understand whether or not we are in a position to evaluate them as progress or as change for the better. How then, this is the second part of my paper, do moral changes come about? Assuming that they do. How is it that social practices like those described above, which were accepted as completely normal for centuries and were interpreted as morally unobjectionable, become an object of public opprobrium? And at least as regards the self-understanding of society, are abandoned. What kinds of changes are involved and what triggers them? Do they come about all of a sudden and unexpectedly, or not so suddenly and as a result of long-term and awaited developments? Do they bring about something new? And who is the moving force with respect to these transformations? Human agency or anonymous forces? I will first approach the question, what actually changes when we experience moral change? And does something new occur when moral change happens? Many contemporary authors point out that progressive moral developments are less a matter of changes in the moral principles themselves than of changes in the catchment area of morality, that is, in the domain of the addressees and the potential domain of application of moral considerations and deference. Where moral progress occurs, previously excluded groups such as strangers, slaves, children, and women are elevated step by step to the status of morally relevant citizenship, with all that this entails. The morally relevant we, the description of the circle of those who we owe a certain kind of treatment, is then extended. It has become more exclusive and hence wider. Moral progress, if we follow such a conception, is a matter of correcting epistemic errors, even if we grant that such correction calls not only for cognitive insight but also for heightening moral awareness or extending the capacity for empathy. We already have the correct norms for how we should treat people, but until now we were mistaken about who counts as a person. A second approach to moral progress describes it in terms of improved institutional implementation of moral principles. Moral progress, on this understanding, is a matter of doing even better justice to what is meant by certain moral principles or what is implicit in them, and of realizing them in deeper or more complex ways in our institutions. Common to both versions now of the understanding of moral progress is the notion that moral progress is not a matter of inventing and implementing new moral principles. It is a matter of reinterpreting or realizing or rightfully attributing already existing principles. Now there's certainly something to be said for this. It is not at all evident that such a thing as a total innovative transformation, that is an invention of radically new practices and principles, unconnected to the ones which are overcome, could even be conceivable at all. Also, to conceive of moral progress as a deepening of already existing principles has the indisputable advantage that the problem of the evaluative standards, why should these changes count as moral progress, doesn't even come up. But still, despite these advantages, for my part, I consider it more than doubtful that all moral improvements really adhere to this pattern of moral progress. And more than that, I doubt that when it comes to the moral principles themselves, we somehow already have what we need. Even in those cases where interpreting progress as a widening or deepening of already existing principles seems to be especially reasonable, sometimes the plausibility is merely apparent. When slavery is abolished, or women included, it is not just that slaves or women are suddenly also people in the full sense. Rather, our understanding of what it means to be a human being or a person has changed. But then it is not just that the circle has expanded. Peter Singer is the one who talks about the expanding circle. It, and hence our conception of morality, has changed its character. And even where it seems especially obvious that moral progress involves a kind of deepening of the understanding of our institutions, it is not easy to draw the boundary between the progressive adaptation to the idea and the genuine renewal of an institution. If today the social institution of marriage is no longer restricted in many countries to heterosexual relations, and the idea of a family no longer solely associated with heterosexual reproduction, Does this really mean that we only now have realized that the deeper meaning of these institutions is that of enabling and protecting intimate relationships, no matter the sexual and or gender orientation of the involved? Isn't it at the same time a pervasive renewal of these institutions? However, a more important point is the following. Perhaps the present-day prohibition of sexual violence gets in fact closer to the normative understanding of marital relations as this developed in the context of the bourgeois nuclear family since the 18th century. But since this understanding of marriage is itself a historically specific phenomenon, how does this transformation come about, the transformation towards this understanding of marriage? And if it is in addition a matter of moral progress, how can we understand this as progress? How can it be understood as a change for the better if the framework for such an evaluation no longer exists here? The dilemma here is the benefit of solving the normative questions within expanding the circle or deepening our understanding approach comes at the price of leaving the social innovations that transcend this framework in the dark of a no longer intelligible paradigm change of some sort. I think that we should adopt a different approach to answering this question. The approach that I suggest aims at overcoming the alternatives of either conceiving progress or progressive change as somehow continuous, or conceiving of it as discontinuous, as a real innovation or paradigm change. My intuition is most of the social transformations that interest us, the moral revolutions as well as the real ones, the radical and thoroughgoing transformations as well as the local ones, are continuous and discontinuous at the same time. Discontinuous in its continuity and continuous in its discontinuity. Just think about the French Revolution. The orientation that I will adopt here consists in the first step in not treating moral change in isolation and in not regarding it as a purely endogenous phenomenon. The thesis that I will pursue here is thus, in order to understand moral progress, we must understand that and how it is embedded in overarching social changes and transformation processes, and we must understand that and how those in turn depend on erosions and crises in the existing moral and social order. I will start with a remark from Marx in order to introduce the first point. Social change as a condition of moral progress. In the third volume of Marx's Capital, we find the following in many ways remarkable statement. I quote, "From the standpoint of a higher socio-economic formation, the private property of particular individuals in the earth will appear just as distasteful as the private property of one man in other men." What interests me about this quotation is less the character of the earth as property, as important as it is, than a small, at first sight, inconspicuous, but nevertheless quite astounding accentuation. Marx claims here that the notion that human beings could fall under the legal form of private property must seem distasteful to us today. In German it's abgeschmackt. This way of describing our attitude towards slavery is disconcerting. Most of us surely think, as Marx certainly also did, that private ownership of other human beings, enslavement or servitude, is not only somehow distasteful, but profoundly abhorrent. Why does Marx use what is in effect an aesthetic category, distasteful, to refer to such a degradation of persons? It is as if he were talking about a mere lapse of taste, as somehow inappropriate, despicable, deflated, but also slightly ridiculous, ugly, vulgar social institution, or even one lacking in style. I suspect that this expression was no mere slip of the pen of such a great polemicist and stylist as Marx. That ownership of human beings now strikes us as distasteful indicates that today the institution of slavery is in a certain sense completely unthinkable for us. In a certain sense, meaning that I'm very well aware of the fact that there is a phenomenon called new slavery, or the fact that a lot of people are still working under conditions that come close to serfdom. That's not the point here, and we might talk about this later. So in a certain sense, it's completely unthinkable. As something distasteful, the social institution is not only morally outrageous, but is no longer intelligible in the Hegelian terms, ethical context of practices, beliefs, and institutions in which we live. To treat a human being as property, to treat someone as a thing, therefore, is not, for example, worse or less bad than deceiving him, stealing from him, or murdering him. Insofar as slavery has been overcome, Marx wants to say it is a category mistake. Therefore, when Marx asserts that from the standpoint of a higher socio-economic formation, the private property of particular individuals in the earth appears just as distasteful as the private property of one man in other men, he means today private ownership of the earth seems to us to be completely unproblematic and without alternative. Unable to imagine a different relation to the world than that of property, it does not dawn on us that this could be a problem. But a different time and a different social order are conceivable in which precisely this basic understanding and agreement, that is, our moral sense, will have changed, just as already occurred with regard to ownership of human beings. Understood in this way, the designation distasteful points to the ethical background conditions, the changes in the proto-values of the society, and possibly also in its fundamental social ontology that make the institutions and practices described possible or impossible, conceivable or inconceivable at a basic level. But then, how do we get from here to there? It seems to be something about the phenomenology of our moral experience that in particular, when it comes to what are for us such salient moral wrongs, we are sometimes confronted with changes that seem at first sight to present us with something like a gestalt switch, like the famous dark rabbit switch. At the same time, however, the Marxian interpretation suggests that we are not dealing with an unconnected paradigm shift, but with a motivated and intelligible transition. As is well known, the Marxian solution to the problem is to claim that underlying the seemingly abrupt change in our moral sensibility is a material transformation that follows an intelligible and necessary, even necessary logic. The social dynamic involved then doesn't originate from a transformation of our moral sensitivity itself, but stems from somewhere else, the development of the forces of production, whereas morality, as an ideology, does not have a history, hence a dynamic of its own. Now there are a number of reasons why I don't want to embrace, or even because it's well known, or more or less common sense, I will not even further discuss the whole orthodox materialist narrative in its one-sided determinism here. Nevertheless, the insight that changes in our moral conceptual world are not purely endogenous phenomena, but that they are interconnected with other social changes, seems to me to merit serious consideration. Thus we can derive at a first thesis about the dynamics of moral progress from this first approximation inspired by Marx. Moral progress, this thesis asserts, does not stand on its own. It's framed by social context and background conditions, and is reliant on them, even if moral virtuosity exists whose judgment is ahead of the social context. Therefore, the change in the normative evaluation of institutions and in their practically effective form, described as moral progress, would not be the result of a freestanding moral insight or a freestanding development of the faculty of moral empathy. It would instead be the effect of a change of full social formations, a change in the surrounding or adjacent practices, and of the social horizon of interpretation within which the practices in question can be understood and stabilized. Let us take the example of marital rape mentioned at the beginning. The de facto toleration of marital rape in Germany, that was until 1997, that rape was defined by law as an extramarital occurrence. So this the de facto toleration is situated in the context of other provisions, the provisions of marriage law. For example, the bizarre state of affairs, again in Germany, that a husband could dissolve his wife's employment contract at will and could also dispose freely over his wife's property. Provisions that remain in effect until 1953. It is situated in the context of a social arrangement in which women are typically economically dependent on their husbands and fits with the interpretation of marriage as an intimate community of fate and an organic unity that would be disrupted by the interference of law. From the general duty of obedience of the wife, operative here, it seems to be but a small step to the duty of sexual obedience. a specific interpretation of male and female sexuality may also have contributed to the fact that the violent, dominant violation of the women's sexual integrity could even be conceived of as a variety of sexual relations, and not instead under the aspect of violence, as we nowadays say sexual violence, with an emphasis on violence. Now, similar embedding relationships could be demonstrated for the institution of slavery and for the problem of violence in education. Thus, slavery in its manifold forms is situated both in a practical continuum with other practices of social domination and of racist exclusion, and with other forms of unfree labor and with social practices of exchange. Corporal punishment of children as well is connected with the guiding concepts of childhood and education in general, and it becomes intelligible if one assumed that the nature of the child is essentially wild and untamed, so that it must be tamed by civilization. But it is also situated in the context of the different social ways of dealing with punishment and corporal punishment and the respective changes they undergo. Thus, morally relevant practices and interpretations are connected with a whole variety of other practices within an ensemble of practices which bear on the domain of morality, but also in part much on more wide-ranging life problems, and also include technical skills and the material with which we deal practically. It is when a whole constellation changes that a specific moral institution can become peculiar, weird, repugnant, or even outlandish. And as for that, can be thematized, rejected, and denounced by social actors or social movements. The ensemble structure that we encounter here is diverse. Moral practices and interpretations exert influences on other practices and are influenced by the latter in turn. They make other practices possible and are made possible by them in turn. Some of these are functionally interconnected or interwoven, but there are also elements that just fit together somehow, that are interlinked, stabilize each other, or belong to the same context of interpretation in a broader sense. And because practices are never raw facts, but are always interpreted as something, the possible interpretations change along with the constellation of practices involved. Thus, if moral practices are framed in the context of other practices, they are also interpreted from out of this context. If marital rape is, in the context I referenced, interpreted as a version of sexuality, or the beating of children as education, then the fact that these practices have not been morally condemned for the longest period of time is related to this context and the respective interpretations. The formation of our moral sense or our faculty of moral perception that we asked about above, then is not an unmediated gestalt switch that leads from one moral evaluation of a situation to another. It's actually not merely a change in our moral sense, after all. Instead, it can be attributed to the change in the background conditions, the subsequent practices, which transforms the surroundings of the morally relevant practice in such a way that they appear in a different light. However, now the question arises, of course, how these changes, the transformation of such ensembles, can be conceived. Thus, our initial question about the genesis of moral change has shifted to the question of social change, its interrelation with moral change, and its dynamic in general. The conception of social contexts of practice suggested here yields some initial clues for answering these questions. If different practices are interconnected in the ways described, then the changes that they undergo can be explained in terms of shifts in a nexus of practices, shifts which are caused by the dissolution of the relevant relations of fit, tangents or even contradictions between coexisting practices and interpretations. As is well known, Marx, as a historical materialist, has a very specific relation of fit, as I would like to put it tentatively in mind, which he expresses pointedly, perhaps even somewhat over-pointedly, as follows. The hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill society with the industrial capitalist. The dissolution of this relation of fit, which is in this case a relation of functional conditioning, now gives rise to the dynamic of change. Maintaining feudal relations under conditions of the steam mill would be a mismatch leading to social upheavals and, according to Marx, ultimately to a social revolution. Or to put it in terms of historical materialism, the development of the forces of production represents a dynamic within which the relations of production that no longer correspond to these forms, I quote, become dysfunctional and a fetter, as Marx says, on their further development. Here again, I do not want to defend these theses. They involve thoroughly problematic assumptions whose functionalism is too one-sided and too deterministic to be of help in a world of complex webs of practice. Still, if we try to understand the ensemble structure in a looser and more open sense, a weaker version of the idea of relations of fit and conversely of mismatches between different practices and ideas seems to me to be still instructive and worth defending. If one inquires into changes that actually happened in the practical field, one will actually often observe that in such situations, relations of fit have become eroded and correspondingly vulnerable. New practices and new technologies are added to an ensemble of practices. The conditions under which the latter are exercised, as well as their interpretation, undergo change. Some practices fit into the ensemble, whether others seem to break it apart, so that in some cases an entire context or nexus of social practices undergoes a complete or partial shift. A well-documented example of this is the social shifts in gender relations that occurred during and after World War II as a consequence of women entering into work relations that had previously been close to them and assuming sole responsibility for the upkeep of the family. But even aside from such dramatic impulses, social relations of work can change in such a way that the institution of the head of household and the housewife marriage no longer fits or fits only poorly into social life. But at first sight, inconspicuous technical inventions can also trigger social and moral changes. What makes the television series Downton Abbey so ingenious in its depiction of how love, war, radio, the telephone and the typewriter, combined with the ineffectiveness of aristocratic agriculture, generate an irresistible dynamic of transformation that undermined and would ultimately destroy the way of life of the English aristocracy. Thus, there are shifts in structures of practice caused by developments, innovations, or different kinds of crises involving change or the detachment of individual moments from structures of explanation of intended and unintended consequences of action. Changes in one complex of practices, the invention of the typewriter, the invention of the pill, or the invention of gunpowder, can give rise to changes in another area without anyone actively intending these changes in question. In his book on moral revolutions, Anthony Appiah defends the, in my view, convincing thesis that it was the new high social regard for and dignity of work, a recent development in the bourgeois world that contributed to generating the solidarity of the newly self-confident working classes with the abolitionist movement against the disparagement of work expressed in slavery. This is certainly only one aspect of the many stories to be told, including a whole set of narratives that include social struggles, acts of resistance, and the agency of the involved. But nevertheless, with respect to this thesis, we have to ask what then, in turn, led to the new estimation of work. If we inquire further back, we will find that this change in the social regard in which work is held was conditioned in turn by a whole complex of social and economic factors, ranging from the loss in social relevance of the nobility, through the change in the technical boundary conditions of work and the new requirements for organizing it based on the division of labor, up to the formation of the collective consciousness of the proletariat and the decline of aristocratic values. Insofar as this is conditioned in turn by a multiplicity of causal factors and already began with the invention of gunpowder that rendered the martial virtues of the aristocracy superfluous, one could develop an admittedly rather simplistic narrative according to which the invention of gunpowder led, however indirectly, to the abolition of slavery. Similarly, it could be claimed that the inventor of the typewriter or the pill contributed to the prohibition of marital rape, without, over long stretches of the plot, any of those initially involved, having intended or even having been able to intend this development. From what has been, we can derive a couple of initial insights for the question of the emergence and the dynamic of both moral progress and social change in general. First, assuming that moral progress, as described, unfolds within the broader context of social change, hence in situations in which, together with the established moral judgments and institutions, other ethical, technical, and cultural practices also undergo change or become obsolete, then it develops in a non-endogenous way. On the other hand, if we proceed from a web of different practices, each with its own developmental logic, its own specific normative character and the resulting dynamic, moral progress is not one-sidedly dependent on or determined by the other changes as well, so not completely exogenous either. But with the locus of moral change has shifted. But with this, the locus of moral change has shifted in another respect. It is not the ideas which first undergo change, followed by the practices, so that the new or newly interpreted moral principles are applied to the practical institutional level in the next step. To the question, who influences whom here? Do the moral convictions and practices influence the other social practices or vice versa? One can answer, in case of doubt, they both influence each other. The practical dynamic intimated here suggests that the decisive processes can be represented as a somewhat messy tangle of ideas, practical changes, and their interpretative recuperation. Sometimes newly emerging interpretations lead to practical changes, while at other times practical changes lead to new interpretations. Sometimes, as Pascal famously had it, we kneel down, move our lips in prayer, and start to believe, and sometimes it's the other way around. And in cases of doubt again, dynamics are at work in which these two moments can no longer be easily separated or unraveled. Third, by embedding moral attitudes and practices in a more comprehensive context of the practice, they are placed in a continuum with other dimensions of social practice, together with their respective forms of knowledge and reflective capacities. As a result, it becomes possible to regard them in the pragmatist spirit as something that plays a role in the practical life of society and contribute to coping with its life problems. Morality as a reflective capacity merges with reflective capacities of other kinds. How we think about organizing our social life, how we should treat each other, turns out to be informed and influenced by other kinds of knowledge about the social and the human world, and the world as such. Coming back to the relation between technological, social, and moral progress mentioned in the beginning, one might say, as plausible it is not to take for granted then that one would be the result of the other, and as important it is to grant an independent dynamic to the manifold transformations in play, to retrieve insights to their respective influences, interdependencies, and intersections might be decisive as well. We are now in a position to answer the questions posed in the beginning. How does moral, respectively social change come about? A tentative theory of social change, again, roughly pragmatist in spirit, then evolves. Social transformations, this is the first point, do not arise out of nothing. They are motivated by problems and crises such that existing practices and institutions no longer function or confront a problem they cannot solve. Social and moral change becomes possible where there is a mismatch between different social practices and institutions, thus where the relation of fit between them is no longer exact. It becomes necessary when the erosion of them calls for the formation of new institutions. If social change then is triggered by crises and upheavals, it is a response to the need to adapt to social situations that have become unclear, hence to problems or even contradictions in the Hegelian sense. The question of how social change occurs then does not take the form, why is it changing at all? Rather, social formations present themselves as intrinsically dynamic formations, which are driven beyond themselves by problems of all kinds in a crisis-prone dynamic. As an effect, then, of challenge and response, the new social practice, institution, or formation, or the new understanding of our practices, is a transformation within a constellation that springs from the manifestations of erosions of the old order. The question of how innovative moral progress or change can be, and whether it can be conceived only as a deepening or extension of existing ideas, is thereby diffused in a certain sense. Problem-solving transformations, as they can now be understood, are at once continuous and discontinuous with previous practice. The solutions neither really already belong to our moral household, nor do they arise in an entirely innovative way out of nothing. Third, as for the role of social movements and human agency in a multi-level picture, as for the role of social movements and human agents, a multi-level picture comes into view. If the possibility of change, the possibility of turning moral wrong into an object of opprobrium, as feminists did in the case of rape and revolting slaves and abolitionists in that of slavery, is bound up with shifts and with disjointed relations of fit, as I have argued, it is both correct and a simplification to say that social change rests on social struggles or social movements. Neither the existence nor the success of social movements rests exclusively on the will and resoluteness of the actors involved. These will depend rather on social and material enabling conditions that must be fulfilled if social actors are to be able to make practical interventions. Against the voluntaristic interpretation, even radical social change, following Marx, calls as much for a passive as for an active element. Or put differently, social conflicts and struggles contribute to changing the aggregate state of possibly latent crisis or phenomena of erosion. I come to the end of my last part. Thus far, I have dealt with the first of the questions raised at the beginning, namely how social and moral change occurs in general and how its dynamic should be understood. In conclusion, I want to turn briefly to the problem of understanding progress as change for the better. Such an evaluation of social change as progress is so difficult and hence in many cases so controversial because we clearly need a frame of reference in order to be able to judge that and in what way something has not only become different but better. This is why it seems so easy to define in reference to technical issues what progress is, and difficult on the other hand when it comes to social and moral progress. The invention of the washing machine represents progress over the laborious practice of washing by hand. The invention of antibiotics and vaccines led to major progress in combating life-threatening diseases. The fact that we find it so easy to identify improvements in the case of these examples, notwithstanding all the ambivalences that are also possible here, is not because they concern such basic spheres of life, but because here we can define the progress achieved within the framework of an existing means-end relation. Progress with regard to washing or healing means quite simply that we now have better means to realize our purpose. But how do things stand with social and moral progress? Improvements in how we conduct our lives and organize our social life. If a purpose could be specified, either of human conduct or of social life as a whole, then it would be fairly easy to identify social or moral progress. Now we are confronted not only, as a matter of fact, with ongoing tensions and controversies in philosophy as well as in real life, regarding the objectives that should direct social life. Beyond this, the very attempt to determine overarching purposes or the aims of human or social life as such seems to be somehow misguided, if only because the individual instance of social life would then be reduced to a means to a predetermined end. And more than that, regardless of the opportunities and possibilities of reaching at least a philosophical agreement here, such an attempt would, with regard to social life, occasion a shift from the question concerning progress to the question concerning the good or the right and how it should be defined. As a result, the question of progress, as I mentioned at the beginning, would no longer be posed as a genuine question, but would be replaced by a discussion about how to define the telos, the content of a good life or the just society. Let's therefore take up the issue of progress as a certain kind of normatively charged dynamics itself. From the proposed perspective I have sketched out so far, this dynamic is a result of social crisis, conflicts, contradictions, and an ongoing attempt to solve these problems, to adjust to the new and reintegrate the situation, but also in a more Hegelian spirit, to accumulate experiences, to learn from whatever has come up as a crisis, and the result establish new demands. Now this dynamic of problem solving, or as a matter of fact, solving of problems of a second order, doesn't run smoothly. It's permeated by relations of domination and prone to systematically and structurally induce learning blockages and upheavals. This opens up the possibility of evaluation qua evaluation of change as change itself. A social change, then, is a change for the better because and insofar as it is or would be a problem-solving process of a certain kind. With this, the question of the criterion for progress shifts to the question of whether the dynamic of this movement is progressive or alternately regressive. Progress would then be an experiential process that is becoming constantly richer, thus one in which experiences are accumulated and conflicting experiences are not systematically blocked. As I said, I'm talking about progress as a concept, not about empirical reality. A typology, or about what it would mean to identify progress in reality. A typology of such experiential blockages and moments of regression, extending from ideological distortions and hermeneutic gaps to experiential impoverishment, alienation, and blockages to collective action, must then provide the normative criteria that in my project take the place of a positive description of the goal of progressive development. That things get better if they do, then, is not because we are approaching an already fixed and normatively demonstrated goal. Rather, it is a matter of the character of the progressing itself. It is this process, and not first its result, that provides philosophical orientation. Progress in this way is conceived, as it were, as freestanding and hence as a principle of movement. This is, to come back to the aims I sketched at the beginning, a non-teleological approach towards progress. Not only are problem-solving dynamics open-ended, within such a process the problems themselves also undergo change, and with them the means-end framework as well. Then progress is not the ongoing mastering of a basic problem or a set of basic problems. Instead, it is a matter of ongoing and progressive problem-solving in the course of which its ends and means can undergo transformation without a definite end. Not the least advantage of such a conception is that it can be conceived as plural. We will then be confronted with a variety of versions of change for the better, of a progressive transition, and a variety of changes for the worse. And these transformations can be evaluated relative to the respective contexts in which they evolved, relative to the diverging problem-solving narratives. There is then not the one and only path to, or rather of, progress. Nevertheless, we will still have the capacity to judge the very quality of these processes. That is, their specific dynamic can be judged as more or less progressive, as adequate or non-adequate with respect to the second-order problems as they historically emerge. This is, to conclude, a somewhat formal account. It doesn't say anything substantial about the content of progress. Progressive would then be an evaluative means to judge a certain social dynamics of change. In other words, we would use it then as a critical as well as an analytical concept. It is also a deeply negativist approach that is informed by the meta-category of non-regression, which brings me to a supposition already expressed by Adorno in a short essay on progress. What progress is can be understood, assuming we want to do justice to the dialectic of progress, only in terms of the concept of regress or regression. I quote Adorno, and this is the end. A situation is conceivable in which the category of progress would lose its meaning, and yet which is not the situation of universal regression that allies itself with progress today. In this case, progress would transform itself into the resistance to the perpetual danger of relapse. Progress is this resistance at all stages, not the surrender to their steady ascent. Thank you so much.
I think we have about 20 minutes for questions, so the floor is open.
Great subject, and really terrific talk. I have two comments. One is perhaps small, and the other somewhat bigger. The small one is this: I don't think
Speak up, Eli.
I don't think you should speak of regression only as negative. Progress is good and regression is bad. There are vast forms of progress that depend on regression. There are many things that are properly called regression that are very positive. Sexuality, creativity, crowd experiences, loss of self, ecstasy, religious experiences, moments of revolution, and so forth. So regression
Moments of revolution.
is moments of revolution. So regression it should be a more complicated idea. And then as far as the larger question, you start really by distinguishing, which I think is brilliant, social change and moral change. You start by saying these are not the same thing. But almost your entire paper is devoted to showing how related they are and how they interact and all the forms in which they interact and so forth. And I wonder if you would not need a more stringent concept of moral change. A lot of even your own examples are not clear to me that it's actually moral change. It's not clear to me, for example, that what happens in Downton Abbey after World War I is best described as moral change. There are moments of moral change, but it's not best described. The abolition of slavery was not an example of moral change. It was a moral change for some people, the people who understood in a deep way why this was such a profound necessity, but slavery was abolished for huge numbers of people without any moral change at all. So it seems to me that, for example, the entire American South, one South. So it seems to me that what is really moral change very often has to do with a break with the social institutions and the social possibilities and so forth, in the sense of, for example, charisma. Not so much something that should be understood in terms of social movements and interactions and possibility, more in the pragmatic sense that you're stressing.
Yeah. One wonderful question, the other very good remark that I'm actually will try to work out a bit more extensively, because I only mentioned regression at the very end of the paper, and as you yourself have already come up with, the notion of regression is of course a very thick notion that needs much more to be explored. Most of all because one should rescue it from the misunderstanding that regression would only be a fallback. So regression is something that is related to the notion of progress and to like a cumulative experience notion of progress exactly because it's about the reduction of a certain kind of complexity. And then of course one can kind of come up with the question of, in certain situations, reducing complexity is a good thing. It's not something that leads to consequences that we wouldn't want to embrace. So thank you so much for spelling out that that one should, into a broader and richer exploration of the concept of regression, one should integrate these local moments of regressions as they then, but I would still argue that they are related to something, that even those moments of whom you want to talk as positive experiences can also have a certain kind of function that leads to regression in the negative sense, right? So this is the kind of need to enrich the very notion and also understand what it is that then, in which respect it goes back, in which respect it goes back to a certain kind of former situation that one, for some reasons, wouldn't be acceptable. The second thing is, the strategy is the following. The strategy is to say, so in the 18th century, and very well reflected in Marx, who's really only mouthing the same kind of optimism that comes from, the fact of technological and progress in mastery of nature and so on, that somehow gives the whole like the background atmosphere of not only buying into a concept of progress or a concept as an evaluational concept, but really thinking like, I mean, everything's getting better on all levels of our experience. So my strategy was to say, this has been taken for granted. This has informed Marx to a certain, I mean, to an overwhelming degree. And it seems to be totally clear that nowadays we are so much more skeptical about it. I mean, to the degree that we would even, that most of us would rather buy into the opposite, saying, like, I mean, to quote Adorno again, that in a certain situation, the increase of technological means would even lead to, to a moral and social situation that is, because the means of domination become so much more effective. Of course, things are getting worse. So we have not only disentangled moral from technological and scientific and other kinds of progress. We are even we even would explain the kind of dialectics of progress in terms of one leads to a decline in the other and so on. So this is the starting point. Then a situation has evolved in which, at least in philosophy, there has been there is an ongoing discussion about moral progress, but not even in in this kind of, you could say, okay, so maybe they are like, to say it in an old-fashioned way, they are like these idealistic, whatever. They just have don't talk about the right kinds of things. They only want to talk about morality and don't want to talk about society. But it's also, I guess, for some of us who would rather focus on social. If we want to talk, to call it progress or not is another question. But this kind of disentangling is very prominent. So my strategy in the paper is to say it is adequate to disentangle it. It's not. No one would buy into the idea that one comes like in a deterministic way, one just comes as a consequence of the other. But at the same time, to isolate moral progress from the other elements is as wrong. So this is what I was talking about. Where I started with, let's take this discussion about moral progress, which reflects our, I would say, some of our intuitions about, let's rather talk about social moral, about moral progress in this kind of an isolated way. Let's disentangle it. Let's take it for granted that all of these phenomena have dynamics on their own. This is what is so wrong about Marx. Or at least an orthodox Marxist account to just assume that the only sphere in which a dynamic action is going on is, on the level of economical transformation, and then everything else would just be the reflection that, and it's informing that. It says they don't have a history, they don't have a dynamics of their own. So this is why I say all of them have dynamics of their own. But then they are not independent from each other. So this is actually the next step. First step is they are totally dependent. Next step is let's talk about it and isolate these elements from each other. And my move now is to say let's have another look at how they are embedded in each other, informing each other, interdependent with each other, and so on. And this is what I try to do. By injecting some doses of. The idea that they do have an effect of each other into the picture, but it's like clearing the place, saying, okay, so let's talk about moral progress, and then introducing all these other dynamics. So that's why I developed the argument the way I did.
Okay, we have lots of people who want to ask questions and very little time. And the reason we have very little time isn't one of the standard academic reasons, like the session's over, but that we have wine and food. We're supposed to switch over to casual mingling. So I don't know if I can get you to be disciplined, but could the rest of you, could the rest of you be disciplined, starting with Paul?
I start to answer with
yes or no questions, please.
In the spirit of wine. And I'm standing up so that you can hear me. So it seems to make great sense to step back from questions about moral progress as being either many matters of right and wrong, or Singer's expanding circle, to talk about social complexity and historical dynamics in the way that you did. And it makes, in the answer you just gave, as well as the talk, it also seems to make sense to then try to think about moral progress in terms of the rational reconstruction one would give of social changes, large and small, which is what I heard you trying to do with the various examples you gave. So I was listening carefully then for the specific, as it were, thesis you wanted to advance about how moral change and social change, moral progress and social change over time. And what I heard, and here's my first question, just to make sure I got it right, was problem solving. What you, at the end, in the last fifth, you talked about problem solving. And that also seems fine, but then I'm left with the question, how is it that a problem worth solving comes into view as a problem worth solving? There's an evaluative question, touching on all the issues of betterment and regression that you want to raise. So there seems to me, at least if I understood your suggestion right, something circular in that suggestion. We would still need an account of how it is that a problem worth solving comes into view. And therefore some way to give some horizon to all the complex, increasingly complex social dynamics which you draw our attention. Some way to disentangle specific practices from other practices, where they begin and end. The kind of open-ended, I think of that guy, I forget his name, at UCLA, I'm promising something. UCLA's anthropologist, the guy who does guns, germs, and steel.
Diamond.
Jared Diamond.
Yeah.
I assume you don't want to go that far. You want some place where the right problems, as it were, the problems that we need to solve come into view. How? That's my question.
Okay, so I tried to...
Yes or no?
Yes or no? Okay, no, I just... I'll just come up with two slogans, and then I will be totally happy to
Slogans are fine.
collaborate, or I mean to have a discussion with you somewhere else. So the two slogans are, and I didn't actually spell this out. Problems that I'm talking about here are problems of a second order. They are not just problems as they occur. They have more like the structure of, I mean, what you would refer to as contradictions. So they are problems not as they just come, I mean, just that we would confront on a first order level, like, let's say we don't have enough food. Yeah, I mean, like, it doesn't rain, we're not able to feed the people. It's on the second order level, which would then lead to a situation where we have not enough food because we distribute it wrongly, or because we fail to build storages, or because we think that it's God's will that all of that.
Telegraphically, how do those Hegelian contradictions come into view as contradictions?
Yes. Yeah. So this is the second. I mean, second slogan is that I borrowed from John Dewey, who would do a great job in spelling out how problems are constructed as well as something that we somehow are confronted with finding reality. So this kind of balance, balance between, I mean, that would come up to problems as something that, if there is a problem or a crisis, I use problems and crisis for the same kind of phenomenon. If there is a crisis, we can't somehow talk it away. It's something that somehow poses some kind of obstacles to what we're doing, some kind of hindrances. At the same time, in order to, at the same time as, I mean, an everyday saying, if you have formulated and established the problems, it's halfway solved, is true, meaning that a big part of identifying problems is, or a big part, it's something that as well can be disputed of how to identify a problem, whether there is a problem, whether there is a problem of a certain kind, and so on. So I'm very well aware that somehow these problems, or the controversies that we have in the ethical field, are not just, I mean, going away once we talk about like problem solving with respect to life, and social life and life in a broader sense. It's not that I would assume that all of a sudden problems have the same structure as a table. It's just that this kind of, and I think it's even an idea that you could spell out with reference to Freud and to what he calls a symptoms. It has the structure of being at the same time constructed. We have to conceive of them as problems, but at the same time, if we don't. And this is why I'm somehow in favor of, against a huge tendency in social philosophy for the past decades where we would only talk about it. It's not that I'm not interested in social movements and social struggles, but only talking about them somehow gets the idea that there is something like objective. I know that one shouldn't, use this word in some the objective part of crisis, something that's going on, it has effects if we don't recognize it. I'm totally aware that that the next step is turning crises into conflicts, that the next step is a controversy about what actually is a crisis and so on, but this slide, let's say, the balance is between constructivism and realism here, where you would count on problems not as something that have their name on, that come up with a label of I'm a problem and the problem is called whatever, injustice, alienation, ideology, but that it's something that at the same time can be, you have to face consequences. So let's say a society has to face consequences once it, or this would actually be part of what I refer to as regression here, to the kind of learning blockages or the kind of obstacles to a certain kind of experience. To just close out. The impossibility to even become aware of a certain kind of problems is then something that would count as. Sorry. So the slide is second order.
Very long slogan. I have a problem and I have a solution. We have a really long list, and there's no way we're going to get through it. But we're in the fortunate situation, which is the next three people who raised questions are people who are visiting the NSSR today. So I'm going to let them have their say, and that will be it. And I'm going to group you together so we at least get your voices in. And that would be Robin, Philip, and then Sabina. Okay, so and even we have only a few minutes, so and then Rahel can have the last word.
Yeah, so thanks. So I found it very convincing how you pushed the notion of progress in this materialist, pluralist direction, but I was wondering whether if one pushes that materialist pluralist point a bit farther, whether something remains of the notion of moral progress as we usually understand it. Because if it is true that in truth these processes that we label as moral progress are so complex that it doesn't really make sense to say that learning processes come first, social change later, or the other way around, but that there are complex dynamics and interrelations between learning processes, material structural shifts, political maneuvering, etc. It seems that the general question, how does moral progress or how does moral change happen, somehow loses its object, because what we have is just different historical contexts and different ways in which these elements are configured. And then I'm just wondering whether that phenomenon which we describe as moral progress is still there, or whether moral progress really becomes some kind of epistemic obstacle almost to recognizing actually the plurality of material factors that you point to, and the fact that moral learning processes are somehow so entangled in these social and material factors that, idealizing and abstracting them from that background is really the primary challenge. And maybe thinking how the moral progress just blocks us from acknowledging that kind of plural and materialist impetus. So that's the question.
Thank you, Robin. Philip?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I'm immensely sympathetic to what you're saying here. And as you say, it's very Deweyan. And I want to push you a little bit more in a Deweyan direction. Once Dewey has given up Hegel as his favorite historicist and converted to Darwin, he tends to think of our social life as consisting of a series of institutions and practices that evolve, and as they evolve, get in one another's way and conflict with one another, and that produces all kinds of problematic situations which then have to be resolved. He thinks, and I think you are echoing him here, that most of what's gone on that we could call progress as we look backwards has been blind. But then he wants to take a further step. And what I want to ask you is whether you want to take that step too. He sees this actually as the entering point at which future generations, by understanding these processes, might be able to deal with them intelligently, so that future social and moral progress would be more systematic through understanding the forms of what you see as conflicts and what one might see as, from a more Darwinian perspective, as failures of adaptation and failures of co-adaptation. So do you want to take that further step? That's the question.
I can make it very short technical, first of all, because Robin already basically took my argument. I'm not quite sure if you really need the notion of progress.
Oh, she says I don't need the notion of morality. You
Maybe a combination. No, that's it.
Why not?
Well, I mean, it's convincing to say the change in morality is related and tangled with the change in social practices, for example. But if you use the notion of moral progress, you always need a point of reference in terms of change for the better, as you said, or in terms of something like regression. But, I mean, the abolition of slavery was moral progress for some, and maybe not for others. The democratization of marriage is moral progress for some, but not for others. So I'm not convinced that the notion of progress in relation to morality really works. I would abolish it in total, but
I know. I mean, I would have guessed. I mean, most people would abolish it in total. That's why I find it interesting. Yeah, very quickly, Robin. I think it's not. I mean, you say the moral progress dimension is going to fade away because in the end it will turn out there's no moral progress. It's just progress or social progress or whatever. I mean, changes in this respect and stuff. I'm not so sure. I think. I think that there are dynamics of their own. There are like these issues that come up where we have to adjust, or where a conflict is a genuine moral or ethical. I mean, I'm not buying into this distinction anyway. I mean, all too easily. Where a certain dynamic cannot be explained. This is why I carefully try to say there are all kinds of connections and all kinds of dependencies. Sometimes it's I don't know, sometimes these other dimensions back the moral part of it up. Sometimes there's some kind of functional dependency and so on. But I my account is pluralist also by spelling out, by coming up with a plural account of possible connections between these different spheres. And I don't think that it's, I would say, why would technology have a dynamic of its own and morality wouldn't? You could, the other way around, you could say technological innovation in the end is so heavily related to, innovations and dynamics that evolve in a different field. So a certain idea about, we were discussing this earlier about, technology and technological innovation as being purely instrumental of some sort is crazy. It needs the life world background conditions as well. It's connected with a certain kind of ethics. It's also connected with whatever. You could, for all these dimensions, you could argue, in the end, if you don't want to end up with a picture where everything hangs together with everything in some not so interesting way, then the next step, of course, in analyzing what happened in a certain progress, in a certain kind of transformation, would be to distinguish. To distinguish it and then put it together and ask for the kind of connections that can be identified. And Eli was right, dynamics, of course, not about moral progress, but there is a moral progress element to it. Of course, this is why it is so interesting that you have all these dynamics that. I don't know. One of the scenes when the radio first plays and the Queen, or I don't know who it was. There's a speech in the radio, and they don't know whether they have to stand up now or not. Listening to this little technical apparatus, you see that somehow reality will not resist this kind of technological. So the idea of how to relate how to organize relations of domination. Not that they are disappearing because all of a sudden we have these democratic technological means, but they are of a different kind. So Dewey and the next step. If I would agree to this idea of Dewey, then I would claim that there is, as an empirical fact, there is progress in history, and I would say, looking back to, when did Dewey write this? Looking back to what has happened in the decades in between, I don't see any evidence that the world has been able to deal with these problems in a more rational way than before. So this would be a complicated issue too. This might be something that you want to come up with as again a criterion for social. So if there was social progress, then it should as a progress in our capacities to it. It would consist in, if you want to restrain from spelling it out with respect to the contents, you would have to spell it out as a accumulating ability to deal with or to deal with them in a more systematic way. But I wouldn't buy into the thesis that this has already occurred. So last point, why progress? Of course, because I want to. It's not that I.
Because it's there.
Sorry?
I said because it's there.
Because I'm interested. When I said it's important as a criterion in a certain kind of social philosophy. Because I want to hold on to the kind of to progress as a concept that combines normative and not so normative dimensions. Of course, this is the idea about it, that to say there is a progress is some kind of a normatively charged change, and we have to be very careful not only to, what I would call a normativist position would say we don't even need the concept of progress because, what we do is we spell out what is right, or what is the good life, and then whatever happens to get closer to what we already know in this respect is, by definition, would by definition be progress, but then progress doesn't, there is no, this is what I mean with a genuine question, then progress wouldn't do work for it. And I think it might, of course, I know all the problems that are, the critique of progress of all sorts. What I said in the beginning, that the thing that inspires me most is actually not progress but regression, and the idea of what would happen if we gave up on the concept of regression in order to analyze what's going on. And I think that what is going to happen then is, the result is a certain kind of moralism on the one hand. You just judge upon the state of affairs on purely and freestanding normative grounds. And on the other hand, you have this kind of overly skeptical, close to relativism analysis that would either somehow parasitically buy into normative standards that have been established somewhere else, or I would say, the current mode. And like a lot of people are overly critical, or get rid of the notion of progress before. What I do here is also to come up with a very deflationary account of progress, of course. Formal, deflationary, not teleological, and to name it. So the whole what you get if you had the real thing, the real sense of progress is much thicker and more demanding. But what you give up is, what you end up with, and this is something I see in a lot of contemporary critiques of progress and notions like progress, is to, I would think, there's even a combination between being moralistic on the one hand, I mean politically moralistic, and on the other hand, theoretically, no one would even dare to buy into a claim that would buy into this kind of normatively charged notion of progress. But I think it's some kind of a mauvais foi. I mean, some kind of there's something not actually open about it, and that's something not actually explicit about it. And I don't mean to come up with this old debate about there are all these heteronormative assumptions, or how can you even go for emancipation without being normative and so on. I mean, I think history of the last decades has proven that a lot of people who wouldn't want to come up with a certain kind of normative theory, I mean, politically spoken, were the ones who did the right thing. Right? I mean, who were able to analyze, to thematize, to fight against certain kinds of domination. It's only that this kind of double consciousness of buying into just taking for granted, and I would still say a lot of people do this, taking for granted that there is such a thing as progress. And again, you see it if you talk about regression, and you see like the richness of the concept if you compare what can be done with the concept of regression as against only having normative concepts. And the end.
Please join us for reception to celebrate Rahel Jaeggi.